I'll record the session. I'll share this with you after today, a bit later on today. The recording will download. I'll send it out to everybody as well. And I'll send you the slides. So you'll have the slides from today's session as well. So thanks so much for joining us. We'll do today in a couple of sections. So I've got some content I'd like to talk to you about. So today's topic is about how we inspire growth through a question-led approach. And that's, as leaders of business teams, how do we stop telling people what to do and start coaching and asking the right questions so that people really start to tune into their own capabilities and take greater responsibility. That's the idea of this morning's session. And it kind of comes from a lot of my experience having led multiple businesses and having got it wrong far too many times. And then making these discoveries about the power of coaching and really developing leadership capability and the difference that makes to engaging and inspiring a team and being able to take a different approach that means responsibility shifts from the leader to having to have all the answers and do a lot of the work to that being transferred to the team. And that's been really valuable for me and my clients as we work together on these principles ourselves. So hopefully today I'll give you some of those insights in this session. And these sessions, the idea of a session like this, these workshops, it will be a workshop because first half we'll talk about some content and principles. Second half we'll just pause the sharing of slides and content, and I'll just open it up to a discussion so we can talk about what that means for your business, what you think that means for you and the way that you lead your teams. And it's quite a useful way to reflect on, okay, what have you heard, what have you learned, and what will you perhaps introduce into your business. But these sessions are a chance to step off the treadmill, because very often in businesses we're constantly at it. We're constantly on some form of activity. A lot of businesses I work with now, they tend to have meetings scheduled pretty much all day, every day. So actually getting that quality thinking time that is really rare. So the idea of these sessions is to give you that quality thinking time back, just to slow down a bit and allow you to think and think differently about what you do. And I'm quite into. I like the evidence around psychology and the way we think and the way we act. And there's a lot of evidence that shows that the way the mind works is it tends to be on repeat mode. So as much as 90% of the time, so 90% of the time we repeat the same thoughts, we go through the same ideas. And so actually shifting away from that and getting some clarity on doing something different is something you can only normally get from an external source. So that's why we run these sessions. So we'll talk about a question-led approach. We'll talk about some things today that I like these sessions to be perhaps a little different from what you'd normally see. So rather than the stuff hopefully there's some things today that will be things that are different from what you've already seen before. So we'll talk about listening and how we should or could start to develop listening skills. We'll talk about question structure and how to ask better quality questions. And then we'll talk about using questions as a tool for change. And then we'll open up to a discussion about that as well. So it's interesting because I love this quote about dependency, because our dependency does make slaves out of us if it's a dependency of self-esteem. And a lot of time in leadership roles, we don't even realize, I didn't even realize when I was in a leadership role, that a lot of my self-esteem was wrapped up in telling people what to do. And it wasn't until I became more aware of that and realized I don't have to have all the answers. I don't have to feel, I don't have to get a sense of accomplishment and progress by telling somebody how to do a job. I can get much more satisfaction in coaching them to their own conclusions, right? Starting to ask better questions. And actually, it's really interesting that when you start to take that approach, you find that the short-term kind of dopamine hits, like the short-term, yes, I did that, yes, I got this across the line, yes, I completed that task, they tend to reduce. But what does increase is the longer-term satisfaction of seeing people develop and grow. And that's quite a shift in thinking for a leader, because we're used to, most of us are high performers, we're really good at operators as well. And to make that shift, it takes quite a bit of conscious effort, because there's a real temptation to just keep, driving tasks and activities. So that is always a reminder. This quote is always a reminder of me, of that principle. And we'll talk today about, these are coaching principles. Questioning and listening are coaching principles. I'm going to share this model with you. If you've seen this before, it's an opportunity to recap. If it's your first time, I'll just orientate you to this model that we use called the coach model. And this is from the book Coaching Leaders that I wrote. It's about 18 months ago now we released it. And the whole idea of the Coaching Leaders model is that we think about a process and a structure for leadership, and in particular, coaching as a leader. And first of all, we think about, in the center of the model is trust and relationships, having strong relationships with people. Because if we have strong relationships, it means we can challenge and push and inspire people. If we don't have a strong relationship, if people don't trust us, the relationship's not strong, it's much more difficult to coach. That people think there's an alternative agenda. When you're asking questions, they think it's an interrogation, not a coaching conversation. So that's really important, the trust and relationships. And then you'll see at the top here, that the first step is about having a plan, right? Having a business plan, having, clarity of what we're trying to achieve, where you're trying to go long term, and being able to communicate and articulate that to your teams. So having a plan is really important, because then people can align with that plan. Once the plan is clear and we're articulating it, and plans change, it doesn't have to be a kind of fixed plan. It could be a flexible plan, but we need to start with an idea in mind. Then we talk about contracting. And contracting is about agreeing standards and agreeing how we'll work with our teams and how they'll work with us and what's acceptable and what's not. So doing that as a structured conversation so that every member of the team is clear about what's right and wrong in the business. Once the contract is agreed, and that's the verbal contract between us and our team members, then it's about creating clarity over objectives and goals. We've got a plan. What is that team member's contribution to delivering on that plan? What are the objectives? What are the goals? How are we going to measure them? How do we review that on a regular basis? Okay. So once we've contracted and the objectives and goals in place, the next step's about, we call it action and observation. This is about creating quality time to observe your team doing their work. Because what happens with team members who are kind of going through their activities day to day, there'll be things they're doing they don't even realize they're doing. There'll be ways to optimize and improve that they can't even see for themselves because they're just so caught up in doing the day-to-day tasks. And our job as leaders is to create some space for observation so that from that perspective, we're able then to see things they can't see. And that's when we can coach them for change. And that really is important. So we'll talk about coaching today, but without the first three steps, sometimes we can find it difficult to introduce coaching as a way of working with our teams. And then just to complete the model, the final piece is, we call it heroes in the making. This is about development planning, succession planning, having conversations with people about their ambitions, about where they fit in the future, helping them to see a greater role for themselves in the business, a greater contribution to the business. And as leaders, that's our gift to give people that inspiration. So that's the model. Useful just to reflect on that model because it is a step-by-step process. And if there's any part of that missing, we might be misfiring either as leaders or with teams. So, but today we're going to focus on the coach for change. So let's talk about listening. I'm fascinated by listening. It's ever since I first went into sales, actually, and a manager I worked with gave me some really useful feedback. At the time, I didn't think it was useful feedback. I thought he was picking on me, but it was useful feedback in that he said, Justin, you don't stop to listen often enough. Feedback like that is, depending on how it's delivered, is very often you almost find yourself defending yourself against it without realizing, because the truth really actually sometimes hits you quite hard. So I then started to cultivate listening, and we'll talk a bit about that today. But I learned these statistics years ago, and they've always fascinated me. So why is listening difficult? So there's an association called the International Listening Association. They do a lot of research on listening in businesses. And the number one barrier to listening is us. But the reason for that is because of these disconnects. And I'll talk about disconnects because this is interesting. I didn't realize this until I first learned these statistics. When we speak, or when people are speaking, we speak at somewhere between 125 and 175 words per minute. When we listen, we're capable of listening at closer to 450. So if you ever find yourself listening to podcasts on higher speed, or trying to watch TV on higher speeds, or whatever it is. It's because you're capable of listening at a higher speed than somebody is speaking. So you can imagine that in leadership roles, this is particularly difficult, because if you've got a team member that's doing work that you're really good at, you know you can operate in that role, and that's normally what happens. If you're in a team, you end up being the manager, and then you kind of know what people need to do because you've been a high performer. That's how you got to where you are. So when you're then spending time listening to people and they're going through the motions and you're capable of listening at a higher speed, it's why we start to tune out. And then if you then process that into kind of brain cognitive function, brain processing speed, we think at closer to between 2,000 and 3,000 words per minute, depending on what it is we're focused on. So all of a sudden you see this disconnect between how fast we think and process and how quickly somebody speaks. And what that means for most people, unless we start to change it ourselves, is that we only absorb between 17 and 25% of what we hear. So this is something that most of us aren't even aware of. I wasn't even aware of until I understood these factors. And fun fact for you on a Thursday morning: the number one reason marriages fail is because one or the other person doesn't feel listened to. Number one reason. So it's not. Yes, we're talking about this in a business context. It affects people in all sorts of areas of their lives. And the answer, there's a number of answers to this challenge around listening. But one of the answers is to develop active listening. So I love this mnemonic for listen. So the L is look interested. So look interested in someone, get yourself interested, right? If someone's talking to you, if one of your team's members talking to you, actually be active in becoming interested in them. The I is to involve yourself by responding. So when people are saying something, respond and acknowledge accordingly. The S is to stay on target, and that's you and the other person. Sometimes the combination of listening and the right questions helps that other person stay on target. The T is to test your understanding by asking key questions as the other person is talking. That keeps you engaged very often. The E is to evaluate the message. What is it that person's really trying to say? What are the words behind the words? And then the N is to neutralize your feelings. I don't know if you've had this, but I've been in conversations where in my mind I'm just like, will you get to the point, right? And sometimes you get quite tied up in that emotion of, God, this person's droning on, they're going around the houses, they're not getting, and that can cause you to feel, a mild level of kind of anxiety or frustration, right? So neutralizing your feelings is actually quite an important thing to tell yourself as you're trying to cultivate listening. But some practical tips for developing active listening. It's about repeating keywords that your team members use, repeating, paraphrasing, just being able to reflect back, almost like a mirror. So you're mirroring the other person through the reflection of some of the words that they're saying. And as you start to do this, make this a habit. It's really interesting because it's a really good way of acknowledging to people that you are listening. And it reinforces that you've understood what they need from you or what they're trying to explain to you. And I also am a real advocate for summarizing discussions. So once a discussion's finished, I'll either summarize it myself or ask the other person, depending on the context, just so shall we summarize? And I might ask them to summarize, and then I'll just sense check myself that I've got that we've covered everything that we've talked about. And the great thing about a summary is not only does it give you clarity, and when you've had a longer discussion, it helps you to pull out the key actions or the key priorities, but it also, over time, when you do it regularly, because you're going to summarize, it forces you to be more attentive, and it improves your ability to influence people because they recognize that you're always tuned in and you're not tuning out. And if I've worked for managers who were terrible listeners, and they'd say, "Oh, could you repeat that?" Or what when you said this, what did you mean? And they completely got it wrong, and their influence drops. Their ability to positively influence you drops. So by being someone that really tunes in, that actively listens, that reflects back, that summarizes, actually, it really increases your ability to influence your teams. So I'll give you a moment just to pause on that and maybe think about for yourself whenever I go through this exercise, these principles of listening, it always makes me think of different situations, and just give you a chance to think about what for you, what you perhaps need to do to either improve or develop or sharpen your listening skills. You can either jot it on a note. If you want to put something in the chat, feel free to do that. If you want to share, then I'd love to hear perhaps one thing that you, as I was going through that, what's the one thing that you were thinking of to improve your listening skills?
I think I think it's taking finding the time to do that quality listening, as it were. So
yeah,
finding that moment to sit down and look at each other and listen.
Yeah. So it's actually it's creating quality time for it. Yeah. Yeah. Because otherwise, I guess, it's all kind of busy work, isn't it?
Yeah.
Busy work, and it's kind of activity and action, and where are we with this and where are we with that, rather than actually creating quality time.
We're quite good at having car conversations or bike conversations because I'm a mobile dental hygienist, but obviously you're not looking at the person, so you are listening, but you're not listening really.
Yeah, and you're trying to concentrate on something else at the same time, aren't you?
This is true.
Yes. Namely, making sure that you're safe, right? Making sure that you're safe. Yeah, good. Any other thoughts from anybody about this principle around listening?
Is my microphone working now?
Oh, I can hear you, Stephen. Yeah.
Good. For some reason, I had 4 microphones to pick from, and it just decided to pick one that doesn't work, which I thought was useful. It's nice to.
That's what Zoom does. That's what Zoom does.
I think there's a couple of things. One is the getting distracted thing, particularly when I'm in my office. I've got 3 screens, emails, Teams popping up and stuff, and actually you can easily catch something out the corner of your eye.
Yeah.
So whilst you are happy to have the conversation, you've got the time, you've got to sort of switch off a little bit. Otherwise, it's easy to look like, even though you are there and you want to be there, you're sort of doing that.
Yeah.
Phone's vibrating or whatever.
Yeah.
And then the second thing I think, which I'm guilty of, is neutralizing your feelings. Just having that sense of, you kind of, even if you're frowning, I think I've got a naturally grumpy face, so I think the ability to sort of frown, it looks like I'm frustrated or annoyed, and I'm not.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm thinking, or whatever it is, I'm cogitating, and so kind of having that passive view, you have to concentrate on that. Otherwise, you just look like you're either, I don't know, people perceive you the way your facial expressions are in a way that you didn't intend.
Yeah. That's a really good point, Stephen, actually, that not only do you need to create the time, but you need to create the free space without any distractions.
Yeah, it's the environment. It's just because typically they'll come into a private office, we'll close the door, they're sat down, it's all lovely, but the phone's vibrating, Teams is popping up on my iPad, and email. There's just too many electronic distractions. Yeah,
and it's everywhere now, isn't it? It's everywhere. It's interesting because one of the first things I normally do when I run a session with a client, I'm just going to check mine now, is I will pick up my phone and I flick, and it's already on mute, but I pretend to flick it to mute. And so I'm just going to mute my phone. And so I don't then have to ask them. They immediately, because I've done it, pick up the phone, do the same thing. And it's simple things like that that help you to create the space to make sure there's not the disturbances or distractions. Yeah, really good. Thanks, Stephen. And that it's interesting because I intentionally will try and put a smile on my face, because when I'm in a conversation, whether it's a coaching conversation or a conversation where people are telling me difficult things, maybe giving me some difficult feedback, my face tends to automatically go to this furrowed brow, and I end up looking like this. And I'm like you, because in the past I've had feedback like, if I upset you, I'm like, oh no, I'm just thinking. And you really have to think about it, because it's not just our emotions, it's how we express the emotions through facial expressions and body language and everything. So really, really good point. Really good point. Because we don't want, because otherwise then we then distract the other person who's trying to have a conversation with us. Yeah, very good. Thank you. Thank you. Excellent. Any other thoughts on this? Anything else anybody wants to share?
Yeah, I suppose my challenge is that work for an international business, and some companies within the group, their levels of English are not very good. So every now and again, if you don't listen and listen and listen, you miss things, and you end up with a lot of misunderstandings as well, because I mentor a lot of the sales teams around the business. And that's a real challenge. And I'll agree with Stephen as well, that if you get a distraction, sometimes I can completely miss. So, I always make a point of summarizing, the discussions anyway, just to, make sure that we haven't got the ambiguity, because we can get that very quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, that's another really good point, John. If you're dealing with international teams, different languages that people are speaking, and it's not their native language, then sometimes you really do have to tune in and listen more carefully. And I think that paraphrasing and almost sense checking, when you said this, did you mean that? Just so that you are clear and they're clear that they've got the message across. Yeah, really good.
Yeah. I recently got asked why I had 121 with my team, and I couldn't work out why they were asking me. And this is a foreign person within the group, and I couldn't work out. And eventually I realized I sent them an email putting 1-to-1s.
Oh.
So
and they just saw it as a number one.
Like, what's 121 got to do with your team? Why do you have 121? Is that how many people you got on your team? Who's there? What's, they just come, and they were so distracted by this 121. So even little phrases you use, which to you are just 1-2-1.
Yeah.
For an English speaker, it's completely normal, isn't it? So
yes, of course. Yeah, you'd see it straight away.
You use just make no sense.
Mate, you're lucky, Stephen, they didn't interpret it as you're going to go for 121% of target. You could have got yourself in trouble there. But it is, it's the little things that you don't even, we sometimes we're just unconscious about, aren't we? We don't even realize it's happening. Excellent, thank you. Okay, good conversation this morning. Thank you, everybody. That's great. So let's continue on. Let's talk about, so that's kind of question, that's listening. Let's talk a bit about questioning. So I'm a lot of the work I do is with either kind of business leaders, or it's with people who are working with clients, or really trying to help engage people in their services for the business. So it's like either commercial growth or it's leadership. And there's a combination of questioning and listening is really important for both of those types of roles. And there's something that I learned quite a while ago, and I remind myself of this over and over, a bit like the listening skills, and it's about questioning skills and knowing the different types of questions and when we should be using different types of questions. And at the highest level, the three types of questions I really like to focus in on are open questions, closed questions, and probing questions. And closed questions, I to be honest with you, I don't really cover them with people, because most people would default to closed questions. The amount of times, I've led a lot of large business teams, a lot of sales teams, and I'll go into either client meetings or I'll go into team meetings, and people default to closed questions. So they'll say to the customer, do you use this? Have you got that? Will you do this? And it's like, and then they wonder why the conversation ends up stilted, because the customer might go yes or no, or maybe, or whatever. And because when you ask a closed question, of course, you get a closed answer. You get a yes or no answer, unless someone's feeling particularly generous and they answer the question and then continue. But I always remember having multiple conversations with different members of my sales teams, and it wasn't until I started to coach people, create some observation space, listen to conversations, I realized just how many closed questions are asked in businesses. And I was running a coaching workshop this week with a group of business leaders on Tuesday, and we were doing live coaching practice, and it was surprising how many people were asking closed questions and we covered the difference in different types of questions, but still ask closed questions. It's so automatic for people. You really do have to catch your teams on this. But the answer to closed questions is remembering to ask open questions, of course. And sometimes you'll ask an open question of your team member, you don't quite get the answer that you were hoping for, so you might have to move to probing questions. So let's talk a bit about those two types of questions. So you'll see on the signpost in the previous slide, right? So the classic 6 open questions. I think it was Rudyard Kipling said, "I keep 6 honest men they're called what, how, where, who, why, and when, right? So that I'm sure you've heard that that turn of phrase. But trying to remember 6 types of questions in the moment is nigh on impossible, right? The human brain doesn't work like that. So I always just remind people to just focus on 2 questions, 2 question starters: what and how. And if you make sure that your questions start with what and how, it will be naturally open. Except, and this is interesting, I see this a lot. So I teach this principle, and people will go, okay, got it, I got it. And then they'll go, so then they start a conversation, they say, so what did you think to this situation? And then they close it with a tag. Did you think this? And it's surprising how often that happens. So we have to really help people to understand. Let's ask an open question and let it land. So, what's your experience of X? Or how have you found this recently in your business? And just leave it. Don't then try and answer the question with closing, which is surprisingly common. But what or how are really effective ways to ask open questions. And what it does, of course, it gets our team members talking, it gets clients and customers talking as well. So what or how is really important. But it takes quite a bit of reconditioning to get ourselves and our teams to remember to ask what or how questions. And then, of course, there are the why questions. So why is a really powerful question if asked in the right context. So the challenge with a why question, and you'll see I've put it in red, and that's intentional, is that why questions tend to create defensiveness. So if I say to a member of my team, why have you done that? They tend to defend their position, to get defensive. If I say to a customer or client, why are you doing that? Why are you using that? They'll tend to say, well, we've always used it, or we find it works really well, or whatever. And all of a sudden you end up in a situation where you kind of created a bit of a barrier for yourself. So what I do instead is I'll either reframe those questions as what or how questions. What led you to that decision? How did you come about that as a way to do it, or whatever the question is, right? But I'll always make it what or how. And I ask why only in specific situations where I know it will have a positive response, not a negative defensive response. And the way I remember it in my own mind is that I'll ask a why question only in reverse. So instead of saying, why did you do that? I might say, why is it important that you change that? So I'll get the person thinking about change or reversing out of their situation rather than trying to embed them and get them stuck in their situation. With a customer or client, I might say, why is it important to change? Or why are you looking to change? And so you get the motivation in the right direction. And it's normally in reverse. It's in the direction of change. And then the second option for asking a why question is to unlock some sort of motivation or passion. So I might ask my team member, why is this so important for you? Why is it important that you change this? Or why is it important that you improve in this area? And that, really drives motivation through the why question rather than defensiveness. With a customer, I might say, why is this important for you to get it right? Or why is it important for us to get this right with you as we work on this project or program or whatever it is? And those 2 kind of specific instances of why questions can be really powerful. And if you do it knowing that you're doing it intentionally, it can be really useful. But very often I see people will ask why questions, and almost as they ask them, I'm like, oh, that's going to get you a difficult response from either the customer or the team member because you've asked why in the wrong direction. And then you end up having to kind of back out of it. So once you've asked an open question, a good, solid what or how question, very often you might not get all of the information that you want. You might not get as full an answer that you want from somebody. And so I'm an advocate for probing. So once you've asked an open question, to then probe, to give the person the opportunity just to expand, right? And I've found that there's 2 really effective ways to do this. The first is, you ask an open question, what's your experience of this? And someone tells you, and then you say, okay, what else have you experienced? So you just say, what else? And what else did you learn, or what else is important? And the what else is a really useful way just to make sure that you go a little deeper with people. And then the other option is then to say, oh, that's interesting. Can you tell me a bit more about that? Tell me more about that. And between those two probing questions or probing structures, actually, you'll find that you can just go a little bit below the surface of what somebody tells you, and they'll open up and you get so much more information. And normally what I've found is by asking I don't know if you've heard there's a root cause analysis structure called Y to the power of 5. And basically what that says is if you ask somebody, why is that? Why is that? Why is that 5 times? Assuming you haven't already got them in defensive mode, right? But root cause analysis says ask why 5 times and you get to the root cause of something. So the probing is the same principle. It's about delving under the surface and challenging the initial answer so that you really help that person think more clearly. And then final thing I'm going to cover, and then we'll open back up to some discussion, are useful questions to ask your team. So these are questions that I've found are really useful in the past, and they're perhaps not the questions that we always consider, but asking the individual people, what does success look like for you in your role? And it's a really good opportunity as a leader when you ask that question to sense check what do you think success looks like for that person? What do they think success looks like for them? It's really interesting. The answers you get to that question can be really useful for you and that person as a way to create a coaching conversation. I also like, if you're managing a team, to ask individuals in the team, what can we do to improve our team culture? If culture is something you really want to foster, and actually a positive team culture is a lot of evidence saying it's a real key indicator for people's employee engagement, satisfaction, and retention of people. So actually, what can we do to improve our team culture? Makes everybody feel involved in it, so they're much more likely to want to stay within your team. Simple question: what's working for you at the moment? What's working for you? What's working for us? What's working? Because that's really, because it gets people to focus on the positive elements of their role, the positive elements of their performance, which very often we perhaps don't always have the time and space for. And then from what's working for you, a nice question: what's holding you back, or what's holding us back? And really, it can be really useful in just helping people to think for themselves about, this is really starting to look at changes. What needs to change. And then when you say what's holding you back, normally it's interesting because very often, that you've heard the adversity opportunity principle. What if this is actually an opportunity? What if what's holding us back is actually an opportunity? It's really interesting. Just the question, when I've asked that question of people where they talk about a challenge, and I'll, as a coaching conversation, I'll very often say, well, what if this is actually an opportunity? They immediately think I know something they don't. And because of that framing of the question, they tend to come up with a different answer. It's almost a perspective shifting question. Really helps people reframe. And it's quite a useful question. If you've not tried that, it's really valuable as a coaching question. And then as a leader, to ask your team, what could I be doing differently to support them, to challenge them, to perhaps improve their performance. That can be really useful because people will give you feedback if you're open to it. But you have to obviously be open to it. So there's some questions that I've found are really useful in the past. So let's open up to the group and to kind of discuss, when you're thinking about coaching conversations, questions that you're asking your teams, the way that you're approaching that. We talked about a bit about listening. I'd be interested in this final conversation. Then what's this made you think about in terms of some of the changes you might need to make when you're having conversations or coaching your team?
I think I'll kick off first. I think it's just starting the conversation with questions rather than because sometimes people will come to you and ask for specific, they want an answer. So it's kind of caged or phrased in a way that says, I need your help, I need your support. And so therefore you kind of feel as though somehow you've been a bit disingenuous by asking questions. You know, I need this fixing, I need this sorting, what should I do? So then somebody say, well, what do you think you should do? It's a bit of a political answer, isn't it? You know, you're not, actually, the self-discovery part is probably more important than you just saying, well, go and press the red button. Whatever it happens to be, you know, just do that. And they go, oh yeah, I didn't realize that. But actually, how do you get them to do that? So I think there's that part of it as well. And I've gone back to the two things I said earlier. It's the kind of smiling when you're talking, or smiling when you're listening, more importantly, and switching the screens off. Just putting, you know, pressing the Windows L key so everything locks. Sticking your phone over to one side and just sort of having that attentive moment. Not getting sucked in immediately to go and press the red button. They go, thanks very much, boss, and they go.
And then next week they come back and say, I've got this problem, what should I do? And you say, okay, blue button this week. Because otherwise you create a bit of a rod for your own back, don't you?
And I think as well, I don't know, we haven't really touched, but I think for me, I've got three distinct groups. I've got direct reports who are self-starters and don't have any management, so they're kind of usually senior salespeople. That's slightly more easier. I've then got managers, first and second line managers. That's much more complicated because they're bringing to you people issues often. And so it's not them that's got it; it's somebody else that's got that as well. And then the trickiest group, I think, is when you're in matrix management. You're running large programs or projects, and you've got people from all over the shop who don't work for you, and you've got to somehow work out an effective working method with them when you're not their boss. You're not even in the same. You know, they're in IT or in finance, and it's very different. And it's kind of adapting your style to those situations.
You've got no direct leadership, or they have no direct reporting responsibility to you. You have no direct leadership responsibility.
They just know that you're some senior bloke in some office somewhere. That's it. You know, that's kind of the extent of it, and that you're the leader for this particular program or project. They may know you, they may not know you. And it's those conversations I find the most challenging. It starts off with who the hell are you kind of starts. Sorry, Fiona.
I completely agree with that. Sorry, Fiona, you go.
Sorry, I was just going to carry on from what Stephen said about I'm a very, very small business, but I subcontract for people to do some marketing and stuff like that. And I'm just thinking about putting together a sort of subcontractors agreement and managing them. But so that's really interesting because how do you do that? And so this is good words that I will practice with.
John, you were going to say?
No, I just to sympathise with Stephen really on that you know I have more dotted lines into me than anything, and you know it's like who's this guy that's turned up from London usually? So, it's influence more than anything else, and you know it's the trust that you have to build and the rapport as well. And I think for me that you know I sort of open and probe and close questions. I have another one, and it's a check question, just to say you know have I understood, and just to be sure that we're all on the same page.
Useful that almost that towards the end of the discussion, just to make sure that you've understood part of the summary, right, John? Check questions part of the summary.
And I think the other thing is as well is sometimes I take it on a negative aspect as well, which you know your questions that we've just been through are positive. So you know I sort of let's say where are the objections? You know what's the problem and things like that. Where I should be be turning it around a bit more. I think. That's the impatience in me.
How do we get progress as quickly as possible? And it's interesting because a couple of things that you have experience of, and I had the same. And when someone comes to you expecting a fix or an answer, there's a couple of things that I found are really useful. The first is remember I showed you the coach model. And the first C in that coach model is contracting. And the contracting is about, what you want to agree with somebody about how you work. So I always advise people that one of the contracting principles should be with your team to say, look, one of the things that I'm committed to do is work with you on your development, right? A big part of that is helping to have coaching conversations. So from this moment on, as we go forward, when you bring situations to me, challenges to me, problems, obstacles, rather than just give you the answers, I'm going to use them as an opportunity to coach. Are you okay with that? And then you can have a conversation about, sometimes it might feel like I'm not giving you the answer, but that's because I really want you to discover these things for yourself and give you the space to think when you come and talk to me. And that's really powerful, because if you can get that agreement in advance, it gives you permission then to coach. And that was it. When I did that for the first time, I remember doing it. I went on a coaching program. It's back in 2006. So it's it's almost 20 years ago. And that was the trigger for me to start. I had the conversation with every single person that worked with me. And then as I went into different business leadership roles, one of the first things I would do is have that conversation with every member of my team, because I'm like, I'm not picking up all your baggage. And I, went into a lot of different leadership roles. And the first thing people do is, I'm sure you've experienced this, they come straight to your desk and say, I'm glad you're in the position now, Justin. We've got this problem, this problem, this problem, this problem, this has happened, that's it. We've got this problem person, we've got this. And I'm like, I'm not picking all that up. Let's have a conversation about how this works. So I'm here, my role now is here to coach you, to help you to get greater clarity on how you address some of these situations. And it's so powerful, because in the first instance, you can see people are like, okay, I'm not used to this. But once they get it, once they understand why you're doing it, because it's to help them start to manage their own situations better, so they're more confident, and actually their recommendations start to get accepted. Because when people come to you with, when you're coaching them and they say, well, I could do this or I could do that, and you give them the positive reinforcement that that's the right thing to do, then they're like, brilliant, I can make these decisions for myself going forward. You create this more independence and greater responsibility in your teams. It's really, really powerful. But it starts with a shift in our thinking first. We have to be the ones that drive that, because teams don't tend to drive it for themselves. Useful?
Yep.
Yeah,
good. And then in terms of the managing multiple stakeholders that don't report to you, it's a similar challenge. And I've had, especially when I'm working on larger projects with people, almost remembering that you've got the activities within a project that need managing, that you're working on with people, but then almost that step back to, actually, should we have an agreement as a project team, even though they don't report to me, about how we work together? And that's almost a step back to fundamentals, so that we can agree, accountability. We can agree that we'll meet our deadlines. We can agree that we're not going to meet our deadlines. We're going to let each other know in advance. We can agree that, even though we're not in direct reporting lines, we're going to, respect each other's responsibilities and make good on our commitments. All of those things. It's the simple things, but sometimes you get those agreements in place with people ahead of getting into the details and the activities. That can be the difference between meeting deadlines and getting the progress that you want in some of those different programs or relationships with people within program. So I share that from personal experience. As I say, a lot of the things that I learned because I got it wrong lots of times, and then I'm like, right, I need to find a way to fix the different challenges and learn these different kind of principles and perspectives, and they were really, really valuable. So hopefully sharing them is useful for you today as well. Okay, good. Any final thoughts? We're at 10 to the hour. I'm conscious you've probably all got 10 o'clock, so I want to try and wrap up by 5:02 at the latest. Any final thoughts on today's topic? Anything anybody would like to either share or ask before we go to it? I've got a couple of slides I'd like to share, and then we'll close. Any more for any more? It's got thumbs up. No, all good. All good. Okay, great. Thanks everybody for being part of the session this morning. I hope you found this useful. So let me just talk about a couple of things. So one of these, you might have seen this before if you've been on my sessions. I feel like since I left, I spent a lot of time in corporate, in large business roles, learned a lot, and kind of sometimes took a long time to learn that. One of the things that I learned too late, but I got there in the end, was this whole thing like, what does it take to be successful in leadership? And recognize that I think you need 5 things. You need the ability to have confidential conversations that aren't with your boss, that aren't with your peers, that aren't in your company. It's really important that you have that safe space. Being part of a community of people that do what you do, think like you think, have some of the challenges that you have, because that helps you to I guess feel a bit more connected. The opportunity to collaborate, so to hear ideas, to share ideas, to have that free flow of different information, and normally from people outside your business, because as I said at the start, most people tend to think the same way 90% of the time. So actually getting some external references is really useful. To have people challenge your ideas, challenge your thinking, sometimes challenge your perceptions, and challenge what you believe is true. Because often, some of the things we believe are true aren't. Like the question, what if this is actually an opportunity? It starts to challenge the way you think, right? So challenge to our ideas is really important. And then finally, commitment. So once we've got all this in play, actually a commitment to put ourselves first, a commitment to make some changes, to act on what we want to develop and evolve about ourselves. And having those 5 things in place is really important. And there's normally a couple of those missing in a lot of our working relationships. And so we try and build these into programs that we run, into initiatives, any client programs. We make sure those 5 things are inherent and embedded within any program. And then the final thing is, if anything we've covered today has resonated with you, if you think actually that's really interesting, if there's some stuff going on for you that you think I'd like to have a bit more, perhaps like a bit more depth on that, or like an exploratory one-to-one conversation about something that's going on, I've just put in the chat for today's Zoom session, I've just put into the chat my calendar link. So this is a link that goes straight to my calendar, and you can book a 45-minute discovery session to talk through your situation, to talk through something that's going on for you, if that's useful for you. And it really is a discovery session. So I'll help you to kind of think about what it is that you're facing or working on, and then at the end of that, hopefully you get greater clarity. That's how it works. Fiona, highly recommended it. Thank you, Fiona. Appreciate that. And then if there's if beyond that there's something else you want to work on, great. If not, then hopefully it's a useful 45-minute session, because it gives you that clear focus and coaching conversation. So that is everything for today. A final thing is just, if there are any final comments or questions, and then if there is, we'll take them. If there isn't, we'll wrap up. So any final comments or questions from today's session?
No questions, but that was good food for thought. Thanks, Justin.
Pleasure. Thanks for joining us, Stephen. Appreciate it. Appreciate you being here. Thank you, Fiona.
Likewise, I always get something, Justin, and always want to get something, and I've got something. So thank you.
Brilliant. My pleasure. Thanks, John. I'm really pleased to hear that as well. It's great feedback. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. So we're Thursday. My weekend starts this evening. For many of you, you might have another day to go. I'm excited about it, but otherwise, have a great rest of the week. Enjoy your weekend when you get there, and I'll hopefully see you at a future session.
Cheers.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Have a great day. See you later. Bye.
Bye.